Hello, Year Sixes. I'm Mr Hutchinson, history teacher here at Bydales. What I would like you to do is look at these four images that are on the screen and just have a think about what you think this lesson, this history lesson we're going to look at today, what it could be about. I'm hoping at least one of those pictures will spring something to mind. It may not. What we're actually going to learn about today is the Titanic, or the Titanic disaster. There's a few pictures on there. We'll see the picture of the ship itself at the very top, a large ocean liner passenger ship made to cross the Atlantic Ocean from Europe over to North America, to the USA. The other two pictures on there, two pictures of two separate rooms within the Titanic. So we can see there's quite a difference in class to the type of people that actually travelled on it. There's quite a stately room there on the right hand side, quite open, large room with a double bed. It looks like it's got a wardrobe and possibly even an ensuite, so a bathroom to be able to use by the occupant of that room. On the left-hand side is the third class. So you had the first class, which is the sort of posh room where the people with a lot of money, usually lords, ladies, those type of people would stay, and that's the one on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side is not even the second class, but the third class passengers would stay. So they are the people that are looking to sort of cross the Atlantic from Europe to America to sort of start a new life. So they're looking to just simply cross that passing, to spend the time traveling, to get somewhere new in the hope that they create a new life for themselves. And obviously you've got the picture there at the bottom of the two characters from the Titanic movie, which some of you may have seen, and I'm sure many of your mothers and fathers have watched on TV. So the Titanic disaster then. So we'll look at numbers first. So when the Titanic sank, there was approximately 2,200 people on board. Only 700 of those people survived. So 1,500 people lost their lives in the Titanic's disaster. So more than 2/3 of the people that were on board the Titanic, so that's passengers, first, second and third class, as well as crew, 1,500 people lost their lives on the disaster. So we're going to look at the reasons why that was, why it was such a disaster, what happened. Now, at Outward, what we do, and especially at Biders, we'll have a challenge and aspire. So our challenge is something that we're hoping to get past during the lesson. But our aspire, it's what we want to do. It's who I am. It's where we want to be. So our challenge today is to be able to describe reasons for the sinking of the Titanic. Why actually the Titanic sank? What were the reasons behind it? Our aspire, where we want to be, is to be able to analyse the reasons and make a judgment. So be able to actually make a judgment of who was responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. We're using source interpretation. What that means is we're going to look at some information from that specific time. So from the time of the Titanic and when it set sail, and we're going to use that to try and make that judgment. So we're going to act as sort of like a courtroom member. We're going to make that judgment based on evidence, which is our source interpretation. So we're just going to go through some of the information about the Titanic first. So firstly, the Titanic was built at the time at a cost of around £1.5 million, which is around £170 million in today's money. So if it was built today, it would be around £170 million, which is a large sum of money. It was built in Belfast for the White Star shipping line. Pardon me. So the White Star shipping line was a large corporation, and it built specifically passenger ships and ships that crossed the Atlantic and made those sort of treacherous journeys that would get people from one place to another. She was the largest passenger steamer of her day, and supposedly the most up to date. So that's why it cost so much money, because everything about it was state of the art, and that's what made it so impressive, and that's why we remember it, not only just because of obviously the disaster, but because it was such a big deal back then. Special watertight compartments made her practically unsinkable, claimed the owners. So they designed it so that if it was to sort of crash or knock into something or had an accident, it was designed not to sink, or so the owners thought. They also advertised the luxurious first-class accommodation, which we looked at on the first slide, those big stately rooms, those big impressive rooms, but it also had things like a Parisian cafe, so a posh cafe as if it was set in Paris. It had a swimming pool, it had a restaurant, and it also had things like games rooms in there, so things like snooker tables, and I'm sure there was a small tennis court. There was sort of these big stately, these big impressive things to show off that it was never going to sink, and it could have all these things and people could be safe and do these things. So the Titanic set sail from Southampton on a maiden voyage on Wednesday, the 10th of April, 1912. It called at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Southern Ireland before actually heading across the Atlantic, and it was on course for New York. So its end destination was New York City in America. That's where it was heading to. But late on the night, Sunday the 14th, so 4 days after it set off, it struck an iceberg, pardon me, and it was hauled below the waterline. So what that means is, as it struck the iceberg actually penetrated the ship under the water. So the hull was under the water, and less than 3 hours, it sank. It actually sank. This unsinkable ship sank. And as we've looked at, only 700 people were rescued from over 2,200 people on board. The sinking of the Titanic with the loss of lives caused uproar on both sides of the Atlantic. So people in America, as well as people in Europe, in England, in Britain, in France, where the people had been picked up, they were shocked. Newspapers blamed the owners for inadequate safety arrangements. Others blamed the captain, said he was just riding too fast, too carelessly in the waters, and the waters themselves were known to be iceberg infested. So why would you have a ship travelling so fast through those type of waters? There were also other reasons to consider, which is what we're going to actually look at now. So let's take a look at the evidence. So evidence here, Captain Smith. So people do blame Captain Smith. I'm going to look at why people thought it was Captain Smith's fault. So Captain Smith was actually due to retire after the Titanic's maiden voyage. So after he'd made this trip to New York and back again, he was actually due to retire. Did he want to retire from sailing by getting to New York in record time? He ignored, or it said that he ignored, at least 7 ice warnings from other ships nearby. So these are warnings to say, look, there's icebergs nearby. You're going to have to be careful when you travel this way. And he's said to have ignored them. Despite having men on the lookout for actual icebergs, the Titanic was still travelling at 20 knots per hour. So that was close to its top speed. It was going pretty much full speed the whole way. If the ship was going slower, maybe it could have just turned out of the iceberg's way in time. Perhaps Captain Smith thought that an iceberg couldn't sink a modern ship. Perhaps he did think it was unsinkable, as the owners had sort of claimed. He once said, "I cannot imagine anything causing a ship to founder or sink. You can't imagine a ship to sink. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. We just don't have sinking ships anymore. They're that strong, they're made, they're well built." Another bit of evidence on that screen is an eyewitness account from a passenger who was actually on board the night it sank. "We were going far too quickly through the ice, and if only there'd been enough lifeboats, no one need to have died." So that passenger picks on 2 bits of information. The one related to Captain Smith is the passenger actually realises the ship's going too quickly. It doesn't have to go that quick, and they're actually seeing the ice on the sea as it's travelling through. Evidence C is also bringing into the fact that weather conditions in the North Atlantic. So this is actually on Captain Smith's side. Usually the ice had retreated further north at the Atlantic by April. So it was the 14th of April that the Titanic sunk. And really, there shouldn't have been any in the Titanic's way. By this time of year, temperatures start to warm up, icebergs are starting to melt. There shouldn't have really been that many icebergs about. So Captain Smith, he's got evidence on both sides, which you'll find probably on every slide. So was it Thomas Andrews' fault? So Thomas Andrews was the man who designed the ship. He was almost like the architect of the Titanic. Many thought Titanic was unsinkable because it had 16 watertight compartments, and as many as 4 could actually flood before the ship would sink. So he'd made 16 water, or the plan was to make 16 watertight compartments, so that up to 4 could actually be filled with water and the ship would survive. However, the compartments did not reach as high as they should have done. Mr Andrews actually reduced the height of these watertight compartments to make more space in some of the first class staterooms, so to make space for these things like swimming pools and these sort of Parisian cafes. If 2 of the watertight compartments had reached all the way to the top of the ship as originally planned, maybe the Titanic wouldn't have sank. So evidence E is eyewitnesses' account from a passenger who was on board the Titanic again that night. And that eyewitness says, "I only realised the situation was serious when I saw a working class passenger on the first class deck." So that piece of evidence actually shows us actually quite a distinctive difference between these passengers that are travelling in the poorly laden compartments, the compartments with hardly anything in them, bunk beds, maybe a toilet if they're lucky, and to these big stately rooms. So the passengers really only noticed the situation was serious because they started seeing these poor people, if you like, coming up to the stately decks up above on the top, where only the first class passengers were allowed to sort of travel. So evidence F concentrates on the shipbuilders. Was it the shipbuilders' fault? So the people actually put the ship together. Titanic was built at Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. About 3 million rivets were used to hold the ship together. So rivets are just sort of like big screws almost that are hammered into place and hold sheets of metal together. Now what we do is we weld ships. Technology's moved on, so we would weld pieces of metal. We'd simply melt the 2 pieces together to form one giant piece. Then they didn't have that technology. They used these rivets, which you can see on screen, these big screws that would push the pieces of metal together and hold it in place. When the wreck of the Titanic was found on the ocean floor in 1985, this is when divers went down to actually look at the wreckage and investigate. Some of the rivets were brought back up to the surface and actually analysed. Investigation showed the rivets were made of poor quality iron. When the side of the ship hit the iceberg, the heads of the rivets simply just broke off, and that section of the ship just broke apart. If the rivets were made from better quality iron, perhaps the sections of the ship may have stayed together, or maybe less of those compartments would have flooded. Perhaps the ship wouldn't sunk at all. Further tests on the steel, though, used for the hull, the place where it actually hit the iceberg, it actually showed that it became brittle in extremely cold conditions. So travelling through these icy waters in these cold conditions made the actual steel itself, the metal the ship was made of, brittle. It made it easily breakable. The next person we're going to look at is Captain Lord. So firstly, Captain Lord, he captained the ship called the Californian. So that was a ship that was 19 miles away from the Titanic when it struck the iceberg. It was actually the Californian that sent the Titanic its final ice warning. So it was one of the ships that said, look, you're going to have to sort of slow down. There's a lot of ice about. Be careful. Around 11:15 at night, the Californian's radio operator went to bed. After midnight, the crew saw rockets being fired in the sky on the horizon. Captain Lord was woken up by the fireworks. So these fireworks were being shot from the Titanic. They knew it was the Titanic ship that was shooting them. Captain Lord, though, was woken up by the fireworks, and he thought the ship, which he obviously later realised was the Titanic, was just having a party. They were just having sort of fun. It was on the maiden voyage. They thought they were just having a party. Firing rockets into the air was part of it, was the captain's doing to entertain the people on board. However, should the Californian have investigated the rockets, should Captain Lord have at least turned on the radio, he would have heard the distress messages and would have been able to help. So evidence H is actually a distress call made by the Titanic on a night, so probably on the same time that the rockets were being fired. We have struck an iceberg, sinking fast. Come to assistance, cannot last much longer. So they knew that they were going to sink. Firing these rockets was still a way of sort of getting attention. If there were any ships around, please come and look at us. Come to our rescue. California never did that. The next person is Bruce Ismay. So was it Bruce Ismay's fault? Bruce Ismay was in charge of the White Star Line. So that was the company that built the Titanic. So the owners of the Titanic itself. He was actually traveling on board the ship, but he was one of the ones that managed to get onto a lifeboat as the ship went down. Ismay actually wanted to prove that White Star Line was better than all other shipping companies. Obviously, he wanted his shipping company to be the best in the world. Now, did he put pressure on Captain Smith to make the ship go as fast as it could, despite travelling through this sort of sea of icebergs? Was he hoping to get Titanic to make a record crossing, making White Star Line stand out even more? Look, we can travel from one side of the Atlantic to the other in record time in such a big ship. One witness who survived the sinking claimed she heard Ismay, so Bruce Ismay, the man that was in charge of White Star Line, the owner of the Titanic, and Captain Smith arguing. So the captain and Bruce Ismay were arguing on Saturday the 13th of April. The ship hit the iceberg on Sunday the 14th of April. So were they arguing about sort of speed? Did Ismay want to sort of push through and have it go as fast as possible? Did the captain not want that? But Ismay wanted it. The evidence H is a picture there, and it's a copy of the blueprint drawing for the Titanic. The little ovals represent lifeboats. So as you can see on that picture, if we count them up, there's sort of 8 in each corner. 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32. So the original plan actually included 32 fixed lifeboats. However, when finished, when built, the Titanic only had 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible lifeboats. So that's just lifeboats that sort of fold up and slot somewhere that don't take up as much space. Each could only hold 50 passengers. And when they actually set off, when they started to disembark, if you've seen the movie, you'll sort of get a feel for that. As they started to disembark once it had struck the iceberg, many were not full when they left the ship. The maximum number of passengers that could have been saved if all the lifeboats were full was 1,000. However, we've looked at this, there were 1,400 passengers on board and about 940 crew. So even if the lifeboats were full to capacity when they left, which they weren't, only 1,000 people would have survived anyway. So they did White Star Line reduce the number of lifeboats again to make room for these stately places, to make the deck prettier, to make it nicer for these first class people to sort of move around the deck and to have a better view rather than looking at loads of lifeboats. I mean, they never thought it was going to sink anyway. So we need to think about that. So what I'd like you to do now, year 6, is usually in history, it's all about opinions. There's no right or wrong answer, really. As long as you can give an opinion and you can back it up with evidence, that's all I want you to do. So what I want you to do is to explain who you think was most responsible. So we've looked at those sort of 5 options. The last one was Bruce Ismay. We've looked, Bruce Ismay was the owner of White Star Line. Thomas Andrews, the man who designed the ship, he was the architect. The shipbuilders who put the ship together. Captain Smith, the captain of the Titanic. And Captain Lord, the captain of the Californian, the ship that was only 19 miles away when the Titanic sunk and could possibly have saved people. What I'd like you to do is, using these sentence starters, is to explain who you think was most responsible. So as you can see on the PowerPoint there, which you'll have access to, is ... was most responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. So there, I'd just like you to put one of those 5. So you may, for example, say the shipbuilders. So the shipbuilders were most responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. This was because, and then give me some reason, some evidence for this. And remember to go back to those slides and have a look at the evidence. So if you did, for example, pick the shipbuilders, you could maybe mention steel was actually low quality. It was quite brittle in cold weather. It was never going to last really against the iceberg. Or you could mention the fact that the rivets were of poor quality. The actual things that were holding the ship together, almost a glue if you like. If that's no good, then the ship's obviously not going to be no good. And I just want you to sort of have a think. There's no right or wrong answer on this. I just want you to sort of give me your opinion. The stretch and challenge on there as well. Actually, before we come into that year six, I'll give you a sort of a model answer, if you like, for that, what I've asked you to do. So this is an example answer. So on this one, so it's explaining Captain Lord was most responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. This was because he mistook distress flares from the Titanic as fireworks, and he thought they were simply having a party. He should also have turned on his radio to hear the Titanic call for help when they said, "We have struck an iceberg." So as you can see there, that one's actually using some of the source information from the slides. So "we have struck an iceberg," that's actually part of the radio message sent out. And it's also explaining that he didn't actually look at the distress flares as distress flares. He thought they were just fireworks. He thought they were just having fun. So that's just a sort of model answer. If you want to try and push yourself, I would like you to try that stretching challenge on there. So a little further task. So I'd like you to try and rank those responsible in order from the person you thought most responsible, but it's probably the person you've written about in this paragraph, to the least responsible. So rank them in sort of 1 to 5. So if, for example, you thought Captain Lord was most responsible, he would be your number 1. And then you would put number 2, maybe shipbuilders, 3, Captain Smith, etc. Whatever order you think. And I would just like to give you a brief explanation as to why you've chosen that order. Why have you put Thomas Andrews as your most responsible and shipbuilders as the least responsible? Why have you done that? Just give me a brief explanation. This is an investigative lesson. So I just want you to investigate and look at the evidence you've been supplied with. Who do you think was most responsible for the sinking of the Titanic? I'm looking forward to seeing your answers, year 6s. And again, I'm Mr Hutchinson. I'm looking forward to teaching you as well in year 7. This is strange for me, teaching over a webcam rather than teaching you in person. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can produce, not only in this lesson, but in September when we return back to school. So take care, year 6s, and have fun.